David St. John said that you are one of the great surrealist poets. And Alicia Parnoy, talking about your book, So Quick, Bright Things, says that you recalibrate literary myths with a surrealistic lens. Yeah. And I know labels are normally insufficient, but there is a strong surrealistic component in your work. Mm-hmm. If we trace that component to the beginning, where does it start, and what was your first encounter with surrealism?
Well, I first encountered surrealism through the poet James Wright, and he encountered it through the Spanish surrealists, of course, and so his poetry got me interested in surrealism as a thing that you could do, you know. And so then I started reading Lorca, and then I started reading the French surrealists, who turned out to be my favorite of all, André Breton and Robert Desnos particularly. So that was my introduction to it and my start. And my first book, again, The Gemini Are in the Orchard, is probably my most surreal. I took the title from a painting by the surrealist artist Leonora Carrington.
Was your muse?
Yes, it was my muse for that book. And so that book is more purely surrealist than any of the other work.
One of your books, which I love, Tomorrow You Will Be One of Us, I consider this book the movie version of the poem How to Make a Dadaist poem by Tristan Tzara.
Right.
So instead of taking words from a newspaper, you take lines from science fiction movies.
Yeah, absolutely.
Could you talk a little bit about the origin of this book and how it happened?
Well, I did it with my husband, Chuck Rosenthal, and the two of us have a thing for old classic sci-fi movies. We just love them, and one of the things that we love about them is that great things are at stake. I mean, the movies themselves might be a little cheesy, but there's always, you know, the whole world is at stake in these movies, and it comes out in the dialogue. You know, and it creates this kind of fascinating existential dialogue about what are we doing here, and why are we here, and what are the other worlds out there, and that kind of thing. So we just started writing down lines as we watched these movies, and just because they were so great, each of us kept a journal, and then thinking of the Tzara, you know, I thought, well, we should just put these together and make poems out of them. So we just developed this process where we would watch a movie, write down lines of dialogue as it was happening, then type them up, and then cut them up into strips and put them in a bowl and pull them out and make poems out of them. And we just kept doing that. It was so much fun, and we kept being so thrilled with the results. I mean, I do think that those are poems in that book.
They are poems, yes, they are poems.
And then we showed the poems to Gronk, the artist who does all of the covers for What Books Press. Fabulous artist. And he also shares this sci-fi interest.
This passion for the science fiction.
For the classic science fiction movies. So what he did was he took a line from each of the poems and did an illustration based on that line, and they are so wacky and wonderful. It's just a wonderful book, I think.
Why don't you read one of the poems from the book? Also, what is amazing, like the poems really make sense.
Right.
In a way, they're like, oh, it looks like, you know, has been written like that. Anyway, it was just...
That's great. I'm glad you think that.
Yeah.
Johnson, Johnson, Johnson! You know, there have been rumors. You're making sounds, but there's no message coming through. You are not familiar with the focusing disintegration ray? You must not continue this monstrous slaughter. You will not become the most powerful man on earth. The next sacrifice takes place tomorrow. The least you could do is ply me with liquor. You know, anything is possible.
I would like to talk a little bit about format. Sometimes I think if you have the right format, you have like 90% of the book or 90% of the poem. And some of your books look very well planned, like the format was there from the beginning. For example, this one, Tomorrow You Will Be One of Us, or also the book So Quick, Bright Things around Shakespeare's Midsummer's Night's Dream. Did you have a very strong plan for some of these books from the beginning, or is that the way it looks to the reader?
I think it looks more that way than in fact it was, but I do tend to get an idea for a book and then run with it, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes it doesn't go where I planned, but in fact I hadn't really planned to do quite so much of A Midsummer Night's Dream. I thought that was just going to kind of kickstart the book. And I thought maybe there would be one or two poems in which I sort of recast myself and my husband as Oberon and Titania, you know, as a way of sort of figuring out something about us. But they just kept being more than about being about me and Chuck. They became about Oberon and Titania in a contemporary setting.
Yeah.
So that it did kind of take over.
Could you read a section from your book, Blue Shadow Behind Everything Dazzling?
The poem Mount Kanchenjunga.
Yes.
Right. One day, climbing to a famous monastery in Bhutan, something puts the mischief in me, and I say to my guide, Pema, a Tibetan, "You really believe that the Buddha flew a tiger to this mountaintop?" Rather than telling me my Western mind couldn't possibly comprehend it, he says, "I thought you were a poet." More than a year later, I answer Pema, "I am, here on the other side of earth, in the land where Hercules is busy murdering the vultures that imprison me, here at the furthest borders of the word, where the bright world sometimes lets itself be seen."
When was the first time you said, "I am a poet"?
Very early.
Very early?
Early on, yeah. I published my first poem when I was in second grade.
Do you remember it?
It was about the changing of the month, and it started, March is marching right on through, goodbye February, goodbye to you.
Wow.
And it was longer than that, but I don't remember the rest of it. And it was published in the local paper on the kids page.
Where was this?
In York, Pennsylvania.
So,
Yeah,
and then, so
so-
you knew from very early that you were a poet?
Well, I did, except that I didn't have any idea what a poet was until much later. I wrote really bad poetry in high school, mostly about the deaths of rock stars. You know, I have a Jimi Hendrix poem, a Janis Joplin poem, and embarrassingly enough, a Jim Croce poem. But they weren't informed by any kind of reading or knowledge on my part. I was just writing. But it wasn't until I went to college and I went to Kalamazoo College first. I started there in Michigan and worked with the poet Conrad Hilberry, who is such a wonderful teacher and a wonderful man. And so he became my idea of what a poet was, and I wanted to be that. You know, he was kind-hearted. He was concerned about the world. He was in love with language. I wanted all of that.
Let's talk a little more about this book, The Blue Shadow Behind Everything Dazzling. I think it's a very brave book, very, you say, non-apologetic book. And you say things like this: "In that deep place where for lack of more clarity, I will say matter becomes consciousness." How do you find the language, because this is, I think, a language issue, to write about these big transcendental topics that are very, very expansive, very dreamlike, but at the same time you are contained, you are believable? How do you manage that?
Well, one of the things that I really go for in my work is that place where the intellect and the imagination meet. You know, I really am probably to my detriment, fond of intellectual discourse. And I love the big Latinate words and the ideas and things, but they are not poetic unless they're accompanied by imagination. And this book came out of a trip to India in which I discovered Hinduism, and the imaginative possibilities suggested by the Hindu worldview just floored me. The idea that you know, that life has been going on for billions of years, and that we are all part of Vishnu's dream. You know, when he opens his eyes, the world disappears. When he closes his eyes, everything exists and takes place. So we're part of this gigantic dream that has been going on forever, and people who were once gods are now ants, and people who were once your mother are now your daughter. And you know, just that sense, and that there's all of this repetition and circularity, that blew my mind. And yet I needed to contain it with a little bit of the Western intellectual tradition. And so that's the, you know, those giant leaps in terms of vision. I think that in some ways it's a visionary book. I was feeling visionary at the time I wrote it. And but yeah, to give shape and form to them, I used words like matter and consciousness.
Because I think it's very easy with these kind of topics to go too far.
Right.
To become too like new agey or lack of content, like too fluffy.
Yeah.
And I like the tension. There's like a tension between these two worlds. I think you call it the imaginary and the intellectual. Yes. Right. Could you read? Is one of the poems I have selected. It's called "What Is So Amazing," and this is the one on page 38.
What is so amazing is not so much what is beneath the house, matter and dirt, nor what is outside it, surges of light, space that has no end, but how it all seems ever to be renewed by something unerasable, an energy that drapes itself over everything like translucent film, so that what was shabby, what was perishable yesterday, today takes in oxygen, makes an exchange with the world, in that deep place where, for lack of more clarity, I'll say, matter becomes consciousness. Those other questions, creation, death, free will, etc., let's continue to defer them. Let them simply be unresolvable. What's so amazing is this apparently unstoppable commerce that the surfaces of all objects, animate, inanimate, and of all minds quaver continuously like water, reshaping themselves into the same body, the world, a candescent breathing whose skin is like a living because.
One of the many surprises when I was reading your work was your poem about Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz. This is from the book Dying for Beauty. Apparently, Sor Juana was forced to stop writing in 1693, but you believe that she kept writing in secret until her death in 1695, and you just wrote her poem. And there is everything in this poem. There is humor, there is political statements, mythology. How do you find Sor Juana, or how she find you?
I discovered her when I moved out west and discovered Mexico. And that was such an exciting aesthetic thing for me. I mean, I became the total gringa chick, you know, in love with Frida Kahlo and Diego Rivera and all of that. And then Octavio Paz's biography came out. And that, I read that, I devoured that book and became fascinated by this woman who was so brilliant, and a feminist, and a nun. And at the same time, I had started working at a Jesuit school So I was starting, for the first time, I was raised Protestant, so I was starting to learn about Catholicism and feeling in some ways a little bit oppressed by the sexism and, you know, all of the priests are men and that kind of thing. And so I related to Sorana's being silenced by the Jesuit fathers. And I was not actually silenced literally, but I was censoring myself a bit. I was afraid of what they would think of my work.
I see.
Right. So I really identified with her, and I came up with this idea for a project. Well, let me write the poems that she either did write and they've been lost, or that she didn't write because she was silenced. And so I took her her interest in mythology, her interest in her friendship with Maria Luisa, her commitment to intellectual traditions, and what I also found was her humor.
The humor, yes.
Right, and I tried to work all of those things into that poem.
Is this time when you moved to the West Coast when you learned Spanish, or you knew Spanish before?
I learned Spanish when I moved out here.
Because in your book, in Dying for Beauty, you code switch. Some of your poems you have Spanish words, and then the poem goes in English. For example, the poem Muñeca, and also the poem I Died for Beauty. You also have translated Argentinian poet Alicia Parnoy. You have, I think, both two books. Volando Bajito, Little Love Flying, and Flowering Fires, Fuegos Florales. Could you talk a little bit about your experience as a translator and these projects with Alicia Parnoy?
Yeah. This has been a great thing for me to be able to work with Alicia Parnoy. I would not have done it if I couldn't have worked with her closely on the translations. I would not have taken on the project just as a sole translator without her looking over my shoulder. And that's what has made the process work, I think.
So it's a close collaboration.
It's a very close collaboration, yeah. I do a first draft of a poem, and then she will write notes on it for me. And then I'll revise and revise and revise, because the other thing I thought about the translations of her first book was that they didn't sound like her. You know, here's this woman who has so much personality and so much humor and is so gutsy on the page, right? And the poems were, you know, a little tamer than that, and I wanted the voice of my friend I wanted to reveal that to people.
So are the translations a factor in the way you write, or they have inform, or I don't want to say affect, but the way you write?
Yeah, I think there's been a real mutual thing going on in the translating process, and because Alicia has translated my poems as well, and what I say is that her poems have made me bolder in a way. I feel as though I can make statements, political statements, or just statements of fact with a little more bravura.
You have a lot of collaborations. You have the collaboration with Alicia Parnoy, with your husband, and what's his name, Gronk, for the paintings, for the book Tomorrow You Will Be One of Us. You also have collaborated with Molly Bendall for the book Bling and Fringe, and I don't know if I'm forgetting something else, but you're one of the most promiscuous poets we have been here. You have been writing with everybody. What attracts you to these projects?
Well, they're fun, for one thing. They're just fun. It's fun to work with somebody on something, and poetry is so lonely.
It is.
You know, and you spend so much time by yourself in these worlds that, you know, you hope at some point other people will respond to them, but while you're composing, you are so alone. And so sometimes in between my own books, I've done these collaborative projects just because it's really very inspiring. And yeah, it pushes me in directions I wouldn't go all by myself.
On your own.
So in that sense, as an artist, plus as a feminist, I believe in collaboration. You know, I think that there is something almost patriarchal about the idea of the artist.
The author.
The author,
Yes.
right, right. And even though that's mostly what I do and how I spend my time, this idea that that you share with somebody is a wonderful idea.
You're a professor at LMU. You are the director of creative writing. I think there's a lot of poetry writing in Los Angeles. There's a lot of production.
Right.
But I think there is very little, I don't know how to call it, critical, literary criticism or
Right.
intellectual dialogue about what is written.
Right.
So as an academic, what's your opinion on this? And then the question basically is, does anybody care about the poetry in Los Angeles? Yes.
Right. I wonder that. I think that's such a good question, because there doesn't seem to be that much being written about it. We have just put out this new anthology,
Yes.
right, which is Wide Awake, which is a wonderful thing. But yeah, the secondary material doesn't seem to be happening so much. And I spent years writing book reviews in probably the 80s and 90s. I wrote a lot of book reviews, and I do think that that's an important part of a poet's task. But I stopped, and I just don't feel like I have the time to be writing critical articles about poetry.
When I try to explain what's happening in Los Angeles to other people, when I go to Madrid, for example, I
Right.
can bring the work,
Right,
but they cannot bring like a frame about the work.
right.
That's what I miss in LA.
Right. I think that there is plenty to be said about the poetry in Los Angeles. I think that there is a kind of Los Angeles lyric poem being written by a number of people, and I would include myself, Molly Bendall, I think David St. John, Ralph Angel, whose work has been influenced by surrealism, some to a greater extent than others, but and also by language poetry. But there is a kind of longing, a lyric longing in a lot of the poems. And if I were to write an article about Los Angeles poetry, it would be about that idea I have about the lyric, the West Coast lyric. But I haven't, really roughed that out.
Will that be the title, the West Coast lyric?
Yes. Yeah, it would. And then, there's the other aspect. There's the sort of stand-up poetry faction.
Yes.
And that is something that certainly could be written about and doesn't really exist other places that I know of, to the extent that it exists here. Suzanne Lummis, Brennan Constantine, people like that.
Yeah.
But yeah, who's going to do it?
Well, we have something here. We have a little bit of seed planted. We have a
right.
seed planted. I would like to finish the conversation with a poem from your book, So Quick, Bright Things. Sometimes when I read a poet, I try to look for the poetica of the poet, to see where it is. And you have a wonderful line. You say, the way the poem pulls to remove itself from its subjects. And I think it's a great line. I think could summarize many of the things you do in your poetry, in your work. So the poem is the title of the poem is Being, Having, Lacking, from So Quick, Bright Things. Okay.
Being, having, lacking, after Hans Bellmer. The doll has 4 legs and no torso, no head, no arms. Hanging from a meat hook, it wears white socks and Mary Janes. Its father was a Nazi. Its mother drowned in a river behind the house. It wants you, reader, to put one of your fingers into one of its apertures. It is something that Oberon, being a decent king, can't bring himself to do. Even Puck falters at this threshold of genital disorder, though eventually succumbing to his role as bad boy in the perverse universe of otherworld sadism, having noticed the way fragments dilute, the way the poem pulls to remove itself from its subject.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.